of they should to prevent such a crisis. And as I mentioned, what's needed essentially is to create, on one level, to try and deal with this new economic class of migrants, to try and actually create a legal class. So forgive me, I have a legal background, so I do believe in the power of the law at times, but I feel there needs to be a clearer classification of migration and immigration of an economic class of people, right? Because it allows them to go through a formal process in which they are now a classification with a protected status. That when they arrive, they also have situations where governments in the responding countries, the receiving countries, have an apparatus set up to deal with them, and people are not being harassed by the police. They're not being forced into trades that, let's say, sex work, for example, where there's often very little protection, if none at all, afforded to them. And it also prevents that, I think, from what we've seen a lot, the capturing of people who are involved in child trafficking, right? So once you get everyone as dependents in an economic class through formal migration policies, you're able to capture more people than you would have and allow them, again, the protection to go on and pursue whatever economic endeavor that they wish to do. And I think that's a very key element that we need to also focus on and lobby for and be able to engage in dialogue with our governments. And looking back to our domestic situation, I think what's very, very key involved in the last point is being able to provide a circumstance where people are able to politically express their opinion and their dissatisfaction with their governments. We've had certain circumstances where people leave for economic reasons, but a big reason is because when they have voiced frustration with the government clamps down. Police are out in their right gear, bullets are being fired, live bullets, not just blanks, and people are losing their lives because there's no freedom to express and have dialogue with state actors about what needs to be done to pragmatically solve situations. So my portion of the talk was just again to give a context of the state and how the state is involved and can do better and be an important actor in remedying and hopefully I think that's where I'm going to end now, and hopefully we can engage in more discussion when all the speakers have spoken. Thank you.
Well, anyways, as we deal with many technical difficulties today, thank you very much for this excellent presentation, giving us an overview of the reasons which lead to migration, whether voluntary or not. And as we see, there seems to be a very fine line between voluntary and involuntary migrations, as the presenter explained before, because most people who decide to migrate is usually as we have seen, we have a tendency to associate migration flows with refugeehood, which we often associate with the very restricted definition of people fleeing persecution. However, this also excludes in certain extent, for example, migrants who are fleeing natural disasters, migrants who are fleeing extreme poverty. Also, you mentioned also the Roma. This is something our organization is working on, and we have seen that even in Canada, where the Canadian government has actually sent that Roma or bogus refugees because they don't perhaps fit in the definition of refugees as stated by UNHCR. However, if you look at the conditions of Roma, we are seeing that there's the rise of neo-Nazism, for example, in Europe, where people are fleeing violence and persecution. And this, the response of the government is essentially in creating policies about refugees, often one that is driven whether by political or economic interest. So when we think of exploitation and migration, we often think also of human trafficking. And today there's actually about 21 million people around the world working trafficked for labor or sexual exploitation. And so our next speaker will speak about the dynamics of trafficking and also distinctions between smuggling, because smuggling is also another form of exploitation in the sense that it's affecting today. We're seeing in the Mediterranean Sea, for example, people are resorting to smugglers in order to escape, in order to reach safety. There's also trafficking, which is another aspect of migration. So it is important to make the distinction between the two, and this is what we will go into next. So our next speaker is Elvira Faria who is now the anti-trafficking project coordinator of the Canadian Council for Refugees. So Elvira has worked in the non-profit sector for more than 20 years, focusing both on strategic communication, human rights education, and public engagement. She is also a writer and journalist, and her work experience spans on national and international civil society organizations, arts, culture organizations, media outlets. The teams of voice, social change, empowerment are threads weaving her diverse experience together. So she is currently, as I mentioned before, the anti-trafficking project coordinator for the Canadian Council for Refugees, and she will speak to us more broadly about this topic.
Thank you, Davina. Maybe I'll just add to that brief bio. A couple of things. One, that I started at the Canadian Council for Refugees a couple of months ago, so I'm really new to the organization. More familiar, but not a newbie, so to speak, on the questions of migration. And speaking to what Zula and both Davina mentioned, is my parents would have been, in today's terms, my parents would have been considered economic migrants, having been part of the post-Second World War wave of migrants from Italy. So I'm very sensitive to questions around policy and how they're constructed and how they affect people's lives. So getting right into it, and I'm going to try to give perhaps maybe a little bit more of a pedagogical PowerPoint presentation. Helps rest your ears, basically visual. So Davina's already mentioned 21 million people are trafficked around the world, but taking a step back and giving a really simple definition, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, human trafficking can be described as an organized criminal activity in which human beings are treated as possessions to be controlled and exploited. So the concept of commodification is embedded in the definition of human trafficking. It's the idea that people can be bought and sold. Economic imperative to human trafficking. But what does this look like in Canada? What's being done about it? What needs to be done about it is the focus of my presentation today. But before getting into the details, I want to just give a really brief overview of what human trafficking looks like from a global perspective. So how do these numbers break down? So 21 million people exploited into forced labor around the world. Around 7 out of 10 of those people are trafficked for forced labor in the private economy. So that domestic work in culture, construction, or services industry. 2 out of 10 around and about 1 out of 10 are in state-imposed forced labor. So things like prison work. Who is being trafficked? The ILO, International Labour Organization, where these stats are coming from, clearly says that the large majority are women, girls, and children. What is Canada? Thanks, Tina, for following along. There are NGOs estimate there are some 16,000 people trafficked in Canada per year. These are very sort of rough estimates because actual hard data is hard to come by. Canada is considered a source transit and country for human trafficking. What that means is that people are trafficked to Canada from other countries, trafficked through Canada, most often to the U.S., to go to the U.S., and they're also trafficked from one part of the country to another. The Canadian Council for Refugees and other anti-trafficking networks point out that it's women, migrant workers, girls, newcomers, basically people with no status, or people with vulnerable or precarious immigration status are those who are most vulnerable to trafficking in Canada. Another characteristic of trafficking, or a characteristic around human trafficking in Canada, is that the discussion is mostly focused around sex trafficking. Of course, this is very important. It affects mostly girls and women. The average age is between 17 to 19 years old, and we've been seeing actually a commodification. There's an increasing demand for preteen girls. It also needs to be said that Aboriginal women are overrepresented in the statistics. Aboriginal women represent 4% of the Canadian population, but over 50% of sex trafficked persons. More recently, however, labor trafficking has been getting more attention thanks to the work of anti-trafficking groups and increasing awareness around labor exploitation. And of course, this is also linked to what we'll talk about later, which is shifts in migration policies and the influx of temporary foreign workers. So to give your ears a rest and draw a little 1 minute of attention to what trafficking looks like in Canada. Here's a public service announcement by one of the CCR's members, the West Coast Domestic Workers Association, and again, created to draw attention to labor trafficking. It's great.
One second. Just want to see if the sound works.
Okay, even if the sound doesn't work, it's looking at basically the different categories of migrant workers who come in.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
However, inadequate.
We want to go back.
Sorry.
The other person joined again.
Seriously?
It's okay. We don't have to. If that's not
Well,
working.
maybe you can continue as you said.
It's okay, because I don't want to waste too much time. There are just a couple of short PSAs, and I also,
Oh,
yeah, there we go.
Because communities across the country need workers to fill labor markets.
Okay, everybody, we're ready. We're gonna start it. So,
Migrant workers need to work legally in Canada because communities across the country need workers to fill labor market shortages. However, inadequate protections for migrant workers makes them often vulnerable to exploitation and human trafficking. I'm having to find the work on shirt too. I'm working all the time.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
If this is happening to you or someone you know, there is help available.
Maybe we'll just quickly go to the next slide, which has another quick PSA. And one of the reasons I wanted to show this to you is because the Canadian Council for Refugees. Oh, not that one.
This,
Let's just shut it down. Yeah, let's just shut it down. It's okay. Sorry.
but just, I will just close this chat call, and then we'll do a private call because people keep joining the conversation.
Okay.
So then also legal.
If you can just shut it down.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah. It was also just a way to introduce you
Yeah, so just
to
call
the
in.
way the Canadian Council for Refugees works. being an umbrella organization that protects the rights of refugees as well as vulnerable migrants. We work in collaboration with members. It's a membership-based organization, and so a lot of our members represent the refugee agencies, and in the case of human trafficking, also anti-trafficking organizations. So these videos were produced by a couple of our members. And it was also just to point to the fact that the scope of human trafficking is huge. The numbers, the extent that it takes place, but why is it so attractive to traffickers is point to next. And it's really a super simple answer. Human trafficking is big business. According to the ILO, it is the second most profitable criminal activity in the world, next to drug trafficking. And the figures that you see on the screen, it represents $150 billion US dollars industry per year. The example of earnings in Canada, according to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, a pimp can earn up to $336,000 a year for one trafficked person. So despite this huge scope, the risk of getting caught and convicted are actually quite low. As of January 2015, there have actually only been a total of 85 cases with human trafficking convictions in Canada. Part of the reasons why the numbers are so low is because the nature of trafficking makes it difficult to identify trafficked persons and to track traffickers. On the part of the trafficked person, it's because of the fear of repercussions for disclosing, for coming forward, repercussions to themselves as well as to their families, things like death threats and other types of threats. Also, it's sometimes they don't disclose because they don't necessarily recognize themselves as a trafficked person. On the part of law enforcement, there's actually a lack of awareness around human trafficking, how to actually spot that there's a potential survivor of trafficking. And within the legal profession, there's a reticence to try cases that don't have many legal precedents. So this is a big issue. As a way to curb trafficking, in the year 2000, the United Nations created the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking, especially women and children. And Canada is one of 121 original signatories to the protocol. But this protocol has been criticized for focusing too much on the prosecution of traffickers and not enough on the protection of trafficking survivors. What is considered a milestone, nevertheless, is that there's a consensus definition around what is human trafficking. Okay, so in this definition, it boils down to three things. Trafficking is considered an act that is taken through various means. Are we there? No, jumped. Through various means for the purpose of exploitation, and that could be, as mentioned earlier, sexual exploitation, forced labor, servitude, or even organ removal. So why is it important? Well, the consensus definition in theory is helpful because it helps to guide national policies around prevention and protection, as well as prosecution of traffickers. So there's measures within the protocol that are intended to guide national policies. It's also helpful, the definition is, because it helps unmuddle what Dina was mentioning earlier, the confusion between trafficking and human smuggling. And so we'll now go to another definition, short definition. A person who is trafficked is kept under the control of traffickers and exploited in some way, sometimes after having been transported across a border. And important thing here is that there's an ongoing relationship with the trafficker, whereas a person who is smuggled receives help getting into a country, usually in exchange for money, and that's usually the end. That is the end of the relationship with the smuggler. Of course, one can become the other. Smuggling can become trafficking at a certain point if something changes in that smuggling process. So, why is this important? To just editorialize a little bit and to speak to what Zua was saying earlier, essentially, neoliberal policies are creating these conditions for the push factor and creating displacement of peoples. And when that happens, both smuggling and traffickers are essentially exploiting migrant vulnerabilities. And then that's where the state comes in, and if their lens for looking at this situation is border security, it means that policies were created that not only criminalize traffickers, but they also criminalize trafficked persons, because migrants are labeled as illegal and unwanted. Again, this is done through increasingly restrictive immigration policies. Policies play into the hands of smugglers, who then have leverage to use against trafficked persons or against migrants, who basically then have less options to permanent immigration status. So taking a critical look at government policies and migrant vulnerabilities is one of the focuses of the Canadian Council of Refugees work, anti-trafficking work. This is when I'm going to introduce CCR to you a little bit more formally. I'd say that the CCR uses a collaborative approach to support and strengthen a national network of organizations working to raise awareness about human trafficking, provide services to trafficked persons, and advocate for better protection. In short, CCR works to identify gaps in services and in policy, and we advocate for ways to fill those gaps. So I'm going to maybe then get into, you might consider the more technical part, but again, to drive home the point that policy matters, it's about really how policy constructs policies that can either positively or negatively affect its citizens. So, what are some of the things that CCR has been seeing within our network and more broadly? There's consensus that migrants have become more vulnerable in Canada, and for a number of reasons. Most significantly is the shift to temporary forms of migration. We also know that this is a global trend, but in Canada, there are 338,000 migrant workers. And what's important here is that this number has actually tripled since the year 2000. The impact of this is that it's putting migrants in situations of dependence with limited rights. And the impact is felt the most on, again, those with no status or precarious immigration status in Canada. Hopefully the YouTube thing will work now, and there's another very short clip.
Let's try.
This is a documentary called The End of Immigration that explores really this shift to temporary, the focus on temporary workers in Canada. Let's see how.
There is manual labor which no Canadian touch. It's been so difficult.
Sorry.
Travailleurs étrangers temporaires sous les secteurs.
Sorry, I'm just going to restart.
We're here to do the very manual labor which no Canadian would ever touch.
What about your experience here? How has it been?
It's been so difficult.
Quand on pense aux travailleurs temporaires, on a l'image des travailleurs agricoles qui viennent ici depuis 40 ans. Mais aujourd'hui, les travailleurs étrangers temporaires se retrouvent dans tous les secteurs.
We set up a group of people who are brought to Canada to work with no protections. So the system, the entire program itself, just lends itself to exploitation.
If I'm going to work in a McDonald's, I will change it in a nice way.
Let's say something happens to your family.
Maybe I will proceed to work. I will sacrifice.
$3.50 an hour is what they were being paid You know, this was a shock. When we first discovered this, we couldn't believe it, that this is happening in Canada.
Just a mention of the temporary foreign worker program, which includes the live-in caregiver program and the seasonal agricultural worker program. It's one of 4 immigration processes that create vulnerabilities for migrants. I'm going to touch on them really briefly, one by one, starting with the temporary foreign worker program. So it really, creates vulnerabilities by design. The program conditions are set up so that migrant workers are actually tied to a specific employer, and of course this creates a power imbalance. The documentary you just heard touched on that. But really examples speak the loudest, and one of the most striking examples of what could go wrong with the temporary foreign worker program is the case of a migrant worker from Jamaica. And this story came out a few months ago, or was published a few months ago. Migrant worker from Jamaica who'd been working in Ontario farms for the last 12 years. He'd been coming as a temporary worker for 12 years. In 2014, he was injured at work. He ended up in a coma in hospital. He lost his visa, his work visa, because he was no longer able to work. And that work visa, he entitled him to some health coverage. When he lost his work visa, he also lost entitlement to health coverage. And at that point, the family reports that he was immediately pressured to return to Jamaica. The family stepped in and they applied for a humanitarian visa. Unfortunately, the worker died before a decision was made around the humanitarian visa. This is one worker out of 30,000 seasonal agricultural workers that come through within 30,000 workers in Canada's seasonal agricultural worker program. And I think shockingly, there's a report by the Canadian Medical Association that says over a 10-year period, around 800 migrant farm workers have been terminated and sent back to their countries for medical reasons. So this is, I think, really illustrative how migrants fall through the cracks, even if there are policies in place that in theory protect them. So another, the last thing I want to mention about the temporary foreign worker program, for those who have been following the news, it was created 40 years ago, and it's over the years become quite controversial. The government has been reviewing the program, and they announced that in the fall, there's going to be some amendments to the program. But of course, we have to keep an eye out if they're actually going to be, they say they're going to be increasing access to permanent status, but that really does remain to be seen. Another process that creates vulnerabilities, we know that, is everyone from Canada? Anyone here not from Canada? Okay, so our last government rolled in a huge wave of legislative changes that had big impacts on migrants. And one of those changes that was introduced in 2012 was that sponsored spouses needed to remain in a relationship with their sponsor for 2 years and live with their sponsor for 2 years, or be at risk of deportation. The Canadian Council of Refugees and others feel and felt that this clearly puts the spouse at risk of abuse and actually increases barriers to citizenship. This is another one of those policies that the current government is reviewing and is announcing that they will revoke this condition. And again, it remains to be seen. But back to the definition of trafficking and looking at the means through which trafficking can occur. Threat is one of those means that is used by traffickers to keep people in check. And we've also been seeing an increase in people entering Canada with student visas. This could be a red flag because some traffickers actually bring people to Canada through student or tourism visas, false pretenses, and when they arrive, they find that they are forced to carry out work. Similarly, the refugee determination system can be manipulated. So some trafficked persons are forced by their traffickers to make a refugee claim, which is either meant to fail or not be pursued. And this essentially puts the person at risk of subject to removal. And the trafficker uses this again as leverage to threaten them to stay in that forced situation. So while all of these processes that create vulnerabilities, you might be asking, are there any avenues to protection? And there are. Each, of course, has their own potential gaps. But the one that is looked to the most for potential protection is the temporary resident permit. And if you can get one, it's valid for 6 months. It gives you access to healthcare, the ability to apply for work or student permit, and also you can apply for renewal after 180 days. Unfortunately, in practice, the TRP falls short. They're difficult to get and only available if a person has an open investigation against a trafficker. So if someone discloses and agrees to cooperate with the police. Of course, this is a huge barrier for, earlier there's fear of repercussions. People don't necessarily want to come forward. I don't want to spend too much more time. I can give you examples of that kind of situation. But another important point about the TRP is that, again, as a result of 2012 legislative changes, if a refugee claim has been refused, you then had to wait another 12 months before applying for a TRP, or an additional year before applying for humanitarian and compassionate consideration. The CCR pointed out to the government that these policy changes created perhaps unintended barriers for trafficked migrants, and the government at the time agreed to look into it a little bit more. In the case of TRPs, actually amended their guidelines to give discretion to their officers, program officers, to then individually subjectively decide whether or not someone would be entitled to a TRP. So I've been focusing on all the negative stuff, so I have to point out, something that the government has been doing that appears that they're paying attention. So really, to wrapping this up, beyond vulnerabilities created by these immigration processes, I do have to point out that there are other overarching challenges, and I'm going to just mention them briefly here. And the existing legislation around trafficking is enshrined in Canada's Criminal Code, as well as in the Immigration Refugee Protection Act as of 2012. But as touched on earlier, this really focuses on criminalizing traffickers and promotes the detention of trafficked persons. How does this happen? It's because there's an emphasis on prosecution and a proof-based approach. So people have to come forward and provide evidence and so forth, rather than a rights-based approach or survivor-centered approach. Also, really importantly, trafficking means that there's generally lack of awareness of human trafficking across sectors, and that means that there's lack of solid data and makes it harder to have a coordinated response, even nationally and definitely internationally. But just from a narrative point of view, one of the biggest challenges is really the state focus on border security, which of course impedes security. So all of these are things that the CCR is trying to address, and has called for a series of legislative changes to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. And the focus is really on three things, like shifting those challenges to increasing permanent status, to expanding the rights of those with temporary status, as well as to introduce legal protections for those with no status or precarious status. And I did bring some documents that actually outline the detailed legislative changes that we're calling for. At this point, everything probably looks dire. Oh my God, what is going on? But our position is that we're really in this together. We're at the World Social Forum. If any of the positive things, the legislative changes that we've been able to influence is because of the constant work of looking at the processes, doing the hard sort of analysis and substantive work, which is, not necessarily the most exciting all the time, but it is essentially the policies that affect people's lives. We want to be able to say, hey, we're paying attention. So if you're wondering what you could do, so there are lots of things. One is getting informed and raising awareness about human trafficking. Join a group, start a conversation within your organization. If you want to take action, you can support the CCR's call for legislative changes, the right to the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. John McCallum, I can provide you with the details of how to do that if you're interested. And if you're an organization, you can join the CCR and join the coalition to protect trafficked persons in Canada. I just wanted to end with a quote from, did anybody see Naomi Klein last night? So in her talk about systems change, she said, politics is not a spectator sport, which I really love. And basically, again, it's just a call to say that we're in this together and let's do it.
Thank you, Elvira. Before we just move on, I just want to make sure that Professor Reddy is with us. Are you there?
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we're just going to switch the screen so we can see you. So just give us a second.
Thank you for this very interesting, somewhat interactive, despite technical difficulties, presentation. It's been very, very interesting, also giving perspective not only to human trafficking, but also in how it affects policies, because we have a tendency to associate issues with migration and trafficking from countries outside of Canada, but Canada being one of their countries who accepts a lot of refugees and who receive migrants, we also have a responsibility, not despite the fact that we don't necessarily produce, human trafficking in Canada, to address this issue, because we are receiving people who are victims of human trafficking in Canada. So we have discussed, our previous two speakers have discussed migration flows and the reasons for exploitation in the sense of humans, if we're looking at as humans as economic commodity through migration. And we are now looking at, in a sense, importations of migrants. So what happens when migrants reach a country, whether it's safety, where their status is guaranteed or not. So I think that when it comes to discussions around refugees and migrations, the word that often comes to mind is the word integration, right? And integration often is also associated with the economic integration of migrants and refugees. And this is something our organization, for example, directly works with. And we, for example, we see that when people are accepted as refugees, we have a tendency to think that their journey ends there in a sense, but I think that from the work we have been doing, we have seen that actually this is something that is very difficult for migrants escaping persecution and discrimination, even when they reach Canada. For example, when they do reach safety, their journey is not over yet, because the quote-unquote integration process is often very difficult. So we have a tendency to say, oh, well, people are here, they reach safety, we give them status, and we tend to forget about them once they have reached safety. But there's a lot of challenges for refugees, for example, in terms of economic empowerment. So when people are here, are they able to lead a life? Are they able to economically survive? And actually, a lot of the policies restricting migrants are, in fact, influenced by this perception. If we see in Europe, if we see even in Canada, that tendency to say, or public opinion as well, that migrants come here and steal their resources and they're not able to integrate, whether in labor markets or others. So our next speaker is going to try to end this panel on a more positive and deconstructing light in discussing how are some of the ways that we can economically empower migrants and refugees. So we are very pleased to have with us virtually, nonetheless here, Associate Professor of Economics at the New School of Social Research,
Mr. Sanjay Reddy, who is essentially a member of the independent high-level team of advisors for the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations on the longer-term positioning of the UN development system. He is also one of the co-founders and team leaders of the Global Consumption and Income Project. He has been a member of advisory panel of the UNDP's Human Development Report, the UN Statistics Division Steering Committee on Poverty Statistics, and board of the UN Special Rapporteur on Rights to Food. So his biography is quite impressive. So just I'm gonna maybe let him give you more talk about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Delphina, for that kind introduction. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, Delphina, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not going to be speaking about all the positive things that can be done. I'm afraid we didn't really discuss that in advance, and I'm not the right person to talk about that. I'm going to, although I will touch on that a little bit toward the end of my remarks, try and just give you a bit of my own view as to what the issues are with respect to the political economy of migration, as a way to try to contextualize and understand all of the very serious problems and concerns that were raised by the previous speakers, who I really, to the extent I could hear them on the not very good line, I really appreciated and admired. And I want to thank both Zua and Elvira. I hope I pronounced your names right, but thank you for your really informative presentations. I can see that in different ways they are involved on the front line of activism, as are you, Delphina, and your organization, Romanipe. I hope I pronounced that right, or maybe I haven't, but anyway, I admire that very much. And so I want to thank you for putting this panel together, and of course, Christina Ruscio, who did so in the backdrop, who was one of my favorite students at the International University College of Turin. Now, let me just start with an incident which some of you will know about, many of you, and many of you won't, which has to do with what are called the Nauru files. Could you just say yes if you've heard of what the Nauru files are?
Yes.
Anybody? Okay. If you haven't, go to the Guardian's website or Google Nauru files and read about this. This is something that came out this week. The Guardian has released a large trove of files which were until now confidential, which refer to the Australian government's doings in Nauru, where it detains a very large number of plain refugee status, which it claims it's processing the claims of. And they're quite a sizable number, in the hundreds. The exact population has varied in size at different points in time, but what the Nauru files bring out is that the conditions on Nauru are quite terrible. And in particular, the recent revelations document the extremely difficult, dangerous, and harmful conditions which are being experienced by children on Nauru. You may or may not be aware that there was an act of self-immolation by an adult refugee claimant on Nauru, a small Pacific island, as you know, which has been contracted with by Australia to be a temporary pen, to provide a temporary holding place for these persons. That person who undertook self-immolation in order to draw attention to the terrible conditions on Nauru, I understand, died in the last couple of weeks as well. Now, the minister in Australia in charge of this issue, I don't remember whether he's called the Minister for Immigration or something of that kind, his name I think is Peter Dutton, had the temerity to suggest that acts such as self-immolation are an opportunistic means of gaining entry into Australia. Now, can you imagine the sheer absurdity of suggesting that somebody would set fire to themselves to the point of causing their own death as a means of gaining This was, of course, condemned by some people in Australia, but unfortunately, to a large extent, it also represents one might call it common sense, though I don't see anything that's very sensible about it, even if it's rather common, of a large part of the Australian population, which has been embracing the slogan of stopping the hoax for quite a number of years. Now, with all respect and appreciation of Zua's position as a lawyer, and my own wife, by the way, is an international lawyer concerned with human rights issues, and working on citizenship issues, I do think that the situation in Nauru is an example of the impotence of international law, I'm sorry to say, not its power, because the Australian government has paid exactly no attention of the United Nations or other entities, and indeed its own High Commissioner, or rather a Commissioner for Human Rights, who has roundly condemned the isolation of migrants in refugee claimants in Nauru as illegal and immoral, and continues more or less undisturbed. And this reflects, of course, the power of the political interests which are involved, and in particular the felt need of the politicians to placate particular sections of the population that perceive a threat of some kind. Now, of course, in Australia, which only dropped its whites-only immigration policy in the early 1970s, as some of you may be aware, which to some extent undermined its progressivism and multiculturalism, it may not be entirely surprising that there is a very strong sentiment nature, but indeed it's present in all of the major countries that are recipients of migrants and of refugee claims today in varying degrees. Obviously, there are some really positive examples, such as that of Germany, which has accepted 1 million refugee claimants last year. It's a really extraordinary thing, notwithstanding the rise of the right-wing Alternative for Deutschland, certain other reactions, and maybe it's not right to call them reactions, certain contrary forces in Germany. Nevertheless, the fact that this has been a policy which has been approved of by a majority of the German population, despite the decreasing popularity of Angela Merkel as chancellor due to this approach, I think is a remarkable thing. And of course, in Canada, the acceptance of Syrian refugees, contrary to the propensity in most other Western countries, is another example of that, to some degree. But the overall climate is very adverse. And I think that if one asks the question of why, then one has to necessarily put this in a context where there are many different phenomena which are at play. One of them is what the sociologist, I'm an economist, but I'm going to cite now a historical sociologist of some renown who influenced the sociologist Anthony D. Smith, called the ethnic basis of nations, right, which is very visible in certain Western European countries, which have and European countries which have an ethnic idea which continually besets any attempt to define nationhood. Hungary today would be an example of a country, and of course the Roma in Hungary are very much experiencing the brunt of this, where the ethnic idea of the nation has come to the fore. And it's very difficult to separate the definition of a national culture or national identity from an ethnic idea. And there are, of course, countries such as France and Britain where maybe it's less obvious, but it's still the case. And I would argue that even in countries of mass immigration, such as the United States, Australia, and Canada, and I grew up, by the way, at considerable measure in Canada, I'd just like to mention that, in Toronto, where I experienced some of the effects of this. Even in countries of mass immigration, such you have aspects of ethnic understanding of the nation. And this is evident in Trumpism in the United States. I'm sitting in New York City, where Donald Trump lives in, unfortunately, but where he's not particularly popular. But at any rate, you can see that the appeal to the ethnic basis of the nation is present even in a country like the United States, mass immigration. we cannot separate ethno-socialism is also linked to, of course, legacies of colonialism, imperialism, and so forth in complex ways from the desire to control and keep out immigration in one or another way. And that having been said, I think we have to also recognize some of the real complexity of the issue and not sweep under the rug or inappropriately dismiss legitimate concerns. I think of the Icelanders, for instance, who have a very small, and if the Icelanders were to accept every single refugee claimant who could possibly have an interest in coming to Iceland, then of course they would indeed be very quickly overwhelmed. And I wouldn't want to call Iceland's having some effort to manage entry into Iceland automatically racist. I think that would be much too simplistic, and one should avoid that kind of reductionism as well. Now, what is involved? Well, I'm an economist, as I mentioned, and so I cannot entirely neglect, and I don't want to entirely neglect the role of economic factors. We live fundamentally in a very economically unequal world. Right? And in this economically unequal world where employment is being generated very inadequately, youth in particular is very high, but in recent decades there's been a very weak pattern of generation of employment, and indeed many traditional livelihoods are also not proving to be very sustainable for a variety of reasons, due to ecological destruction, due to social, cultural, and economic changes. The gaps which exist in relative and in absolute terms are in many cases increasing, or at any rate not materially decreasing. And a very large part of the success in the developing world has been concentrated in small numbers of countries, and in particular in one country, in China. Now, people don't move only because of differences in income. In fact, it's surprising that as few people move as they do, given the enormous differences in income that there are. And it's because, of course, as we all know, people are motivated by family considerations, by innumerable considerations of various kinds, which make it something that they don't want to do unless they actually must. And so it's not particularly surprising that it's only in situations of extreme economic distress, or indeed in situations such as that which exists in Syria, where war has created a push factor which is extremely powerful, that people leave. But even there, one of the interesting phenomena that we see is that it's not necessarily the poor or the poorest who leave. This is a great misconception. It's often people who are able to scrape together things in one way or another. This doesn't mean that they are well off by any means. They may in fact still be people who are experiencing stringency in different ways, but they're people who are able to scrape together the means to leave, and whether that means paying human smugglers or traffickers, or whether that means in other ways. It's certainly the case. There's often a barrier as well. Earlier this year, I visited El Salvador, which was a very fascinating and also disturbing experience for me, because that's a country which also generates, or is generating currently, a very large immigration of people, partly for economic reasons, but it's not really the economic reasons alone that explain it. Roughly a third of El Salvador's population is now resident abroad, and mainly in the United States, though not only. And the primary reason for that, of course, in addition to the economic differences that exist, the economic opportunities in the United States or elsewhere, and the proximity between El Salvador and the US specifically, is that in the aftermath of the end of the Civil War in El Salvador in the early 1990s, a different kind of a civil war has emerged, which is less well known. And this involves drug gangs, which prey upon communities, and in particular on young people. And parents who want to save their young people, or want to find some way of coping, which avoids the difficult and terrible choices which they're often faced with in that economy, leave for the United States. So it's very often as much a question of protecting people, the depredations of criminal gangs in the case of El Salvador, as it is of seeking economic prosperity. So we have to view this as a multi-causal phenomenon, and of course it has very specific kind of geographical dimensions to it, which is why, in the world you have immigration flows which are very much connected by prior history as well as, and that also, of course, influences the patterns of ethnic and racial discrimination which people are subject to when they arrive in particular societies. Now, there is very little reason, general backdrop, to expect the forces that propel people to move or to seek to move to disappear or even to diminish in the next decades. So what I would project, if I were to be realistic, as my baseline scenario, as it were, is that there are going to be very large continued movements of people. Some of them are going to be new and surprising movements. Many of them are going to be continuations of existing movements. They will take, to a degree, the form of grasping whatever legal opportunities are available, but they will also take the form of finding other ways of getting to various destinations. And this is going to place enormous strains upon both the societies which receive people and those from which they leave. And I think that some of the intensity of the debate that we have seen on immigration and on multiculturalism is really just the beginning of a much larger debate that we're going to have. And I think that that this brings us, therefore, inextricably to the question of how to manage or address or deal with demands and these realities in ways that are constructive and as constructive as possible. So now finally, Delphina, I'm going to try to talk a bit about the more positive things. Now, many of the refugee claimants in Europe and elsewhere have noticed that it's very difficult for them to find society. And that's very often because of legal restrictions. They can work, for instance, and how easily they can work, how easily their qualifications are recognized, something which immigrants to Canada have complained about for decades. I'm not sure how much it's changed, but they've complained about it for a very long time as well, that it becomes very difficult for them to find a foothold in the labor market in the country. And I think here, a really very significant aspect of the problem is the failure on the part of governments and of the populations concerned to recognize that their responsibility is not one of admission to a country to enable them to pursue certain opportunities, or in the case of refugees, to provide them a safe harbor. But their primary responsibility is to enable the individuals and groups concerned to have effective conditions for being able to be well remunerated and positive and constructive participants in and contributors to the society in a diversity of ways. And this means having much more of a bridge to the labor market, but also to higher education, recognizing the diversity of strengths which different kinds of people bring in an open-minded way, and trying to build upon that to the maximum extent possible. And I think that one way to go about this is to have a commission or an entity in each country which is really tasked with a simple objective, which is to scan the field and identify what are the barriers which should be removed, and what are the things which should be done positively to try to create more of a capability to strengthen the bridge from being in a country to doing things that give one a sense of belonging to the country, but more than that, much more than that, to actively contribute to the country and to the society in a way that is also very rewarding in every sense, materially and socially and psychologically for the persons concerned. And this is fundamentally then not a question of charity or management of diversity. It's rather a question of how to make a suitable investment in people recouped by the society. And that is the case fundamentally, I think, which ought to be made in the larger community. That whatever the reasons there are, that there are people in a society who, in whom such an investment should be made, the investment should be made because there's an economic as well as a social and political case for doing that. And much more sensitivity then is needed to understanding what are exactly the obstacles, what are exactly the potentialities there. And that has to be a very country-specific and to some extent also individual and group-specific determination. Right? It cannot be just a question of bringing people to a country and then leaving them, or allowing people to be in a country and leaving them to their own devices, or for that matter, freeing them from the clutches of exploiters of one kind or another. Though that's obviously something that's extremely crucial and important to do. And I think that if we view the problem in this lens, then that draws our attention away from the language and the metaphor of integration, and calls upon us to use other language and to have other ideas in thinking about how people should fit into a society and how they can contribute to a society, by using language such as engagement, for instance, which really requires something of both sides. It's not just a question of folding people into something that already is, but engaging with them as they are, but also, of course, giving them opportunities to engage with the society as it is. I think there could be much more to say about that, and what could be much more specific about some of the potential things that could be done or could be tried. I was recently in Germany. In fact, I spent a couple of weeks in Germany this summer, and I read, for example, that the large German companies have been urged to set up apprenticeship programs for Syrian and other recent refugees, especially those with some technical background, try to incorporate them into employment. And there are some teething problems which have been discovered. It's certain that many of the refugees, even if they claim to have certain kinds of credentials, in the views of the German companies, really didn't have credentials which were adequate in terms of technical knowledge to even enter some of these apprenticeship programs. And I would say it's not necessarily a bad thing to have made that discovery. Rather, it suggests the ways in which those programs have to evolve in order to actually achieve their ultimate goal. But what's very clear is that if the society doesn't invest in building that kind of a bridge, then the cost to it in the long term would be much greater. And so there's a very, very powerful case for doing that. I think I've gone on for a long time, so let me stop there and look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
And apologies for the misintroduction. I'm replacing Christina as a moderator. So although you did touch on some possible ways to foster economic empowerment for migrants and refugees. So I just want to, before engaging in discussion, thank all our panelists who are present with us, either in person or virtually. I really appreciated all of your contributions. It's been a very, very interesting discussion, and thank you to everybody who came here. So essentially, we're going to open the floor for questions and discussions. And one of the things which we would like to see today is if there are, in some of your countries, maybe best practices, and this is some of the issues you encounter in your respective countries, or if you're aware of best practices, of whether a political or a civil society solutions that are able to foster economic empowerment for migrants and refugees, or on some of the other issues which we touched upon, whether it's policy on trafficking, or in terms of migration flows. So we're open for discussions. Oh, yes. So if somebody you have questions, you have to come up to the front and address your questions directly to the microphone, so Professor Reddy can hear you.
My name is Norbert Shea, and I'm with the Jesuit Refugee Service here in Montreal. I have two questions. One, in terms of the numbers that we get, you talk about, I forget your name, sorry. Elvira. You talk about estimates of 15,000 people. Where do you get those numbers? Those are estimates. You can't. You just yeah. So that's my first question. My second question or comment is regarding the migrant flows that we see. François Crépeau, who is the special rapporteur to the United Group, almost lost that.
You can speak in there.
Okay, no, I was following, so.
I was speaking there, so you can hear maybe better.
Yes, François is the UN Special Rapporteur to Europe, and he has some interest, if you're aware of it, regarding how we can organize not just refugees, but migrants. And the idea regarding migrants, or some of the things that he suggests, is to be able to have special visas where people would be able to come for a certain amount of time, open work visas, so they would be able to find work, because he argues that migrants, obviously, as we've heard, will come anyway. And so we might as well organize it. And they do the jobs that, as we saw, they do the jobs that none of us want to do here in Canada or in Europe. And so we might as well organize it. And so if people can't find jobs during a 6-month period, for example, then they have to go back to their country and then try again the following year. So they would have like an open 5-year visa. But if they break the rules, then they are not allowed to come back afterwards. So those are some of the ideas, and I think it speaks to the idea of organizing this in a better way. And he has some other ideas on obviously on refugees and how to do that. So I'd just like to hear your comments regarding those kinds of ideas. Sorry, just one last thing. And this is short of obviously giving them permanent residence, because I think the ideal is to give people permanent residence. As here in Canada, we need to, I think, do that for our temporary worker programs. Thank you.
So I guess the first question is to me. So the estimates, the question is actually based on a 2010 report from the International Center for Criminal Law Reform and Criminal Justice Policy. If you provide that, I can write that out for you. But another reason that it is a good question is because it speaks to one of the gaps around human trafficking, the ability to actually identify survivors of trafficking and come up with good figures. And one of the things that we're doing at the CCR is we created a human trafficking assessment tool that hopefully enable service providers to, again, this idea of a coordinated service, and to be able to to facilitate the interview process with someone who comes in to a frontline service provider, and the person who's interviewing them won't necessarily know what to look for. With the assessment tool, hopefully it'll be easier for them to be able to spot some of those red flags, and if we can get some of that data, the idea is to have more, again, coordinated effort across the country, and there's also efforts internationally to have more coordinated efforts to have better numbers. The ILO itself, in terms of their estimates, just published this whole methodology and how they came up with their figures. I don't have the methodology for how the 16,000 was coming up with. It was reached at this point, but it is an actual official. I also have comments about your other questions that so the temporary, this idea, and I apologize for not knowing the details of what the UN rapporteur was suggesting, but this idea of a temporary residence permit is, well, we already have one in Canada, and what the CCR is proposing is that it actually expand the protections within that, because even if you do have a policy in place, what I tried to show in the presentation is that, if you don't have, if one department is not speaking with the other, things fall through the cracks, and you're not even realizing you're creating barriers, and you are creating barriers. So, from my perspective, anyways, I think it's about how to ensure that we're speaking to each other, like with state actors, but non-state actors, and just because I just saw Naomi Klein last night, it was great now. I think a lot of it is about changing. In terms of how to create change, we have to change our logic. We have to change the paradigm that we're thinking, in which this economy, because the discussion today was about the global economy, and so we have a consumption-based economy. What the manifesto talks about is doing a whole paradigm shift to switching from a consumption-based economy to sort of a caretaking economy, and like caretaking in a really broad sense. Not just those who are involved in the health sector, but looking at green jobs as people who work in public service, media, people that work in arts and culture. These are green jobs, people that do the work that, as you described, that nobody else wants to do. That's also a low carbon green job. So if we can shift that focus, it's almost like implicit that then people will have more rights because they'll be more valued. So I think that's really. The reason I come back to Naomi Klein is because she talks about an intersectional approach, and we can't really be talking about, okay, this is the issue that affects migrants, and this is the issue that affects the environment. Like, these are issues, they're intersectional issues, and we're not going to come up with solutions unless we speak to each other.
I definitely agree with that. And I can only really comment on my context, and as an African, as someone who was born and raised in Zimbabwe, I came here, just for tertiary education. But what I want to focus on is, let's also just step back, and also migration is not just happening from the typical south to the north. It's also happening within the south. There are centers of that are drawing people towards them. So if we look at Africa, a big example is South Africa, right? So South Africa is, until recently, it was Africa's largest economy, certainly Africa's most dynamic economy. It's now second to Nigeria. But the point being, the reason why, I founded the organization Govern Hearts Africa and focusing on governance, because in our context, governance and law and the rule of law is still very, very important to address, more so into the world, because we are now beginning to experience a lot of phenomena that, quite frankly, institutionally, we were not caught up to deal with. And when we consider the conversation of changing people's status or affording people more rights within that status, it's a very challenging issue for us to deal with in many African countries, because let's take South Africa. South Africa has been a hub and a magnet from people from my own country, Zimbabwe, because economically the circumstance has not been fruitful at all for the last 15 years. And what that meant is that we've had such a migration of people to South Africa legally, but mostly illegally, right? And what this created is essentially a tension between a lot of the local South African population and what they consider outsiders, foreigners who are coming in to take their job. In the last 5 or 6 years, we've had 2 episodes, unfortunate episodes of xenophobic attacks from other Africans, South Africans, against other Africans, Zimbabweans, Angolans, Mozambicans, Somalis, who are coming to the country. So now when it comes to the issue of discussing politically how we can extend more rights to these temporary workers, if you will, it becomes very, very problematic, because from the politicians' point of view, they want to win elections and they know their citizenry doesn't want the influx of other migrant workers. And therefore, the condition to begin to extend their rights in that country becomes even more challenging and sometimes down near impossible. You know, in neighboring Botswana, Zimbabweans were being rounded up forcibly and deported. You know, despite whatever circumstance they were in, you know, mainly again going there to be maids and you know, gardeners and very low-skilled jobs, you know. And South Africa then began to also deport people, but then because of international outcry within Africa, they put a pause on that program and are now trying to figure out how to deal with people from a legal standpoint who have no status, but again, they have to take care of their own population who want jobs for themselves and the influx of people. So the conversation of them having this expansion of right is the right one to have. I was trying to contextualize some very unique challenges that are being faced by certain African countries as well.
Professor Reddy, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, just very briefly, because I think my colleagues on the panel have said a lot of interesting things about it already. But just to say very quickly that you know, I think the argument for a temporary permit of that kind, and I don't know the specific proposal, I haven't come across it, is sound from a political point of view, and even from, to a considerable degree, from a moral point of view, insofar as with respect to political refugees in particular, one is to provide temporary protection as long as that is necessary. Now, I'm not sure if that's the sole motivation, but if that's the sole motivation, one could certainly understand that proposal, which would to some degree also calm the anxieties of the populations in a country that do not wish to admit asylum seekers. That having been said, I don't know if conceding to those anxieties is necessarily the best way to proceed, as opposed to trying to build a more open society that can accommodate genuine diversity. Now, in the case of Germany, for instance, I think that many Germans have the view that a lot of the Syrian refugees are going to go home. I don't know whether or not that's going to be the case, even if it becomes possible eventually for them to go home. Based on historical experience, this may not be the case. There's some very prominent Chileans or people descended from Chilean refugees in Sweden because they made homes there. And then they became politicians in the Social Democratic Party. So you have that kind of phenomenon where people they create lives for themselves, and naturally at that point it seems to be unreasonable and even inhuman. Make a declaration that they must leave. So I think that we have to have a more serious understanding of how our lives become mutually interdependent and our identities are changed when there are large numbers of people who are resident in the society for a period of time. And I would think that that's the better way to proceed, even if there's a political tactic which is attractive here.
Thank you. Just before taking on the next question, if I may build up on that a little bit, obviously not an expert in political migration, but working actually towards the integration of people who are coming here as migrants and refugees. What we see on the ground is a gap between policy and practice. And for example, even though Canada is known as a country who's been receiving a lot of migrants and refugees, I think, although we have to be careful in using the terms, for example, inclusion, as Professor Reddy mentioned, I much prefer the term socially engaging migrants and refugees. But despite all the policies in Canada, for example, on the ground, when we receive people, a lot of people are disappointed in the sense when coming to Canada because of things that they were promised before migration. The Canadian migration system is very complex in the sense that there's a lot of criteria for people coming here. There needs to be high-skilled workers, education levels, language levels, especially in Quebec, where people are required often to be proficient in French. And when they come here, often they are facing a lot of barriers in accessing, for example, the labor market, often because of the lack of credential recognition. For example, we have some doctors who are actually doing unskilled work, so such as taxi drivers or other forms of unskilled labor, if you will. And I think that one of the things would be recognizing the credentials also of high-skilled migrants. And we have a tendency to think that refugees, as mentioned, or poor people escaping war. But a lot of refugees are actually, highly educated people who had professions in their home countries. And when they come here, they start in a sense from the beginning. And the other problem is also lack of information. So people come here and yes, they were granted status, but they don't know how the healthcare system works. They don't know how to access the educational system, for example. There is a language barrier. For example, in Quebec, we have French and English laws, which for young kids working actually with young migrants, this is a big issue because we have, for example, young migrant kids coming from countries where they have been educated in the English language, and then they come here and having to lose sometimes French again, and some of them drop out and don't finish high school, where these people were people who might have, had better chances of education in future in home countries. And some of these things are often not all policy oriented, like what we do, for example, at the schools, when we welcome the kids and their families, and we take the time to ask them about their status, to inform them, because at least in Montreal, we have a lot of organizations. CCR is one of them, a lot of what we call it, in a sense, settlement services, where there's people who are there to inform people, to guide people through the healthcare system, through the educational system, just accompanying a family who doesn't speak either French or English to a doctor's appointment to understand if they have a disease, what the disease is, and if they have access to that service. Also in schools, there's a lot of different things that parents don't understand. Some kids who could have perhaps gone through adult education and finished their diploma end up wasting 2 years simply because they didn't have the information about the proper service that they had the right to access. So we're talking today a lot about policy and legal things, but just on a more practical level, there are services that exist, but we're simply not using them because there's a lack of information. When migrants come here, they don't know where to go to, they're not informed of the services that exist. So yes, policies needs to be changed, of course, but I think that on the ground also there are more, perhaps less challenging things that can be done in order to facilitate, I think, the economic empowerment of migrants. So that was just my comments on this. Sorry.
Could I just add one thing to that? I think that's a really great comment that you made, Davina. The one thing I want to add is that I think that a lot of the resentment of migrants on the part of native-born people in various countries has to do with the idea that things are being done for them which are not being done for native-born people. And I think that there it's really crucial for government to very consciously reframe what it's doing as to facilitate productive contributions to society. It's not a transfer, it's not a handout, it's not something that helps somebody at the expense of somebody else, especially in a situation where the traditional working classes are, to be quite honest with you, decimated in many of the advanced industrial countries because of the deindustrialization that's taken place and because of competition associated with globalization. And so there is a real need to speak to that anxiety, and that's not pandering, that's really framing what to do in a better way that communicates its reality.
Yeah, if I can just add very quickly as well, sorry for the next question. Again, going back to my context of Africa, the funny thing is that, before we were colonized, movement and the dwelling of people of different tribes and regions was very, very common. And this implanted notion of statehood and borders created a system where you now, by virtue of the system, see people as other. And I think going back to what the professor has said and what's also been mentioned, I think what's important is to sort of try and recapture, and perhaps with the involvement of government being a messenger, but also in society, the concept of one people, right? Or at least people who are able to live together. And in Africa, it would be a Pan-Africanism, where, for example, in the situation of South Africa, South Africans don't see other Africans as invaders, but they see them as fellow brothers and sisters. And I think whilst things are being done on the political level, on a policy level, socially, there certainly needs to be more engagement and dialogue and embrace of one another to, again, be the fuel that sort of pushes a circumstance where there's peaceful cohabitation and there's no resentment towards people supposedly taking jobs that belong to you. And I think that was brought up in the discussion.
Yeah, I will just add my 2 cents to this too, because I think that the connection between perhaps the comments and thanks to all of you is, back to the idea of the temporary versus permanent, is this idea of, are we creating second class, first class, second class, third class citizens, and kind of speaks to this idea of like the services being offered to one group of people versus another. Like, I think that's the mindset that has to change, and that's where I think it's not about this is what's happening in policy, this is what's happening on the ground. It's that if policies are created that actually give less rights or create more barriers to people, then that's not necessarily actually helping the dialogue. And thank you so much for pointing out the perspective, on the ground surfaces, because there are a lot and there are so many gaps within that, but there's also some really amazing work that's being done to provide services.
So we're gonna give the floor back to the public, so we want this to be an engaging discussion, so comments or questions, please. You have to come to the front so everybody can hear you. Sure how this works.
I'm sorry, I'm a little fuzzy, but thinking of something very concrete. When we heard the person say, this is about the temporary migrant workers to Canada. When we heard the person say on the video clip, these are jobs that Canadians don't want, and these are jobs that Canadians wouldn't take. And I've heard this statement many times. If you look at the implication of that, we seem to take it for granted. They are every time they hear it. If we improve the conditions of these people, who's going to do this work? Are we thinking about that, or what does it imply? Of course, we have to improve the conditions of these people. We also have to remunerate work properly, and this is systemic in the whole economic system. So just wanted to point out that, because these kinds of statements need to be challenged.
Before leaving the floor to the speakers, I just want to maybe take another question, just so, if there is one. No, otherwise, is it yeah, go ahead.
Thank you to everyone. Maybe my question is too specific, and if it is, then feel free to avoid it. But I was wondering in particular for women who are trafficked into developed countries, if whether the legality or that country's state of whether that's legal or illegal, if that has any real implications to these people, especially because so much, as you mentioned, is underground and we don't even know about the real situation because it's hard to understand that. So I was wondering whether the legality or illegality played any role at all.
Maybe just, I don't know if I fully understood the question. So someone is trafficked from another country, across the border to Canada.
Yeah,
for example. And whether or not it makes a difference, whether they come here. So
what the country's legal, if the country considers that
Right.
work to be legal.
Right, okay.
Do you want to take the answer?
Sure. I think that's sort of, perhaps I'm reading into your question, but I think that's where the distinction between smuggling and trafficking is important. If somebody's come through a smuggler, essentially they would be legal. Have they come here, someone recruited them or transported them across the border for the purpose of forced labor, in which case they would be illegal. And that in that case, they would be completely under the threatened coercion of the trafficker. So it has actually a huge difference on their access to rights, whether or not they can smuggle or traffic. Either, and your point about challenging those statements. That was why I personally added my editorial comments about changing the value of work or seeing work in a different way. Is in fact that is one of the global trends, right? So people are mentioned Italian background, and in Italy that's a huge issue in terms of migrant workers taking on agricultural work, and there's lots of uses within that sector as well. And why is no one doing the work? So anyways, I'll let other people comment as well.
Professor Reddy, did you want to jump in?
Yes, please. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'd like to briefly comment on the two excellent questions, and actually I'd like to integrate them, if I may, a little bit. I think that some of the role of trafficking organizations in a number of areas, farm work, sex work, and so on, has very much to do with the fact that it's work that is often poorly protected and not very visible, and of course also inadequately remunerated as a result. So the first questioner's suggestion that we shouldn't take it as granted that certain occupations will have those characteristics, but rather we should aim for a more generalized battle to improve conditions across the board, including in the occupations with the worst working conditions and wages, and which are in the shadow of the law or not recognized at all, I think is very crucial. There's a real win-win here that's possible between workers who are more organized and who are in the formal sector, and to make a very rough distinction, and those who are more informal sector occupations of one kind or another, those who are in the north and those who are in the south. The improvement of workers' wages and working conditions in Bangladesh is, of course, very important for those workers in Bangladesh. But it's also very important for workers in Europe or in North America. Because even though it's not going to make it economical to stitch a garment in Montreal that is now being outsourced to Bangladesh, whereas 50 years ago it might have been made in Montreal in every case, nevertheless, there's a wider range of activities that are going to be economically possible to do in Montreal as opposed to in Bangladesh if wages and working conditions are better in Bangladesh at the same time that workers in Bangladesh are going to be benefited. In fact, co-authored a book on international trade and labor standards with a philosopher named Christian Barry, which broadly makes a proposal of this kind as to how that type of generalized improvement can be brought about. And the idea is that to the extent that countries such as Bangladesh and Kenya and Mexico can together undertake efforts that improve their labor standards and working conditions, that will mute the competition between them. And at the same time, they will be very attractive destinations for certain kinds of production, which are very labor intensive and which benefit from relatively lower wages as compared to the north. While the garment workers in Montreal or elsewhere, to the extent they still exist, will have a greater role in such an economy. Of course, they may be doing things that are much more high-end and which require much more specific kinds of labor. That's one example, but I think it's true across the board that there's a win-win. It's not a conflictual situation as much as is generally suggested. Yes, people, quote unquote, benefit from being able to have the low-cost labor of other people, but they also would benefit and do benefit in other ways as workers and as consumers from having better wages and working conditions. And that argument has to be made much more fully.
Thank you. Is there any comment, question?
Yeah. As we were earlier talking about Sweden and the immigration policy that Sweden had adopted towards migrants and the acceptance of the migrants in the country, should the Western countries more like adopt this this kind of policy of immigration that Sweden has and the Scandinavian countries have done since 2013, since the quest of the migrants in Europe? Despite the high rate of crimes that are unfortunately increasing in the country of Sweden, and unfortunately today Sweden's capital is the rape capital, as some of the European parliaments say in Europe, because unfortunately today, as Sweden opened its borders, the rape rate had increased and had not decreased instead. So, despite this increase, the rate that is increasing nonstop, should the Western government try to adopt this kind of policies like Sweden and the other Scandinavian countries? Thank you.
If there is another question, we'll just take it now to give speakers a chance to answer, and it's going to be probably a last question because we're running out. Yes.
So my question concerns forced migration, and I'm interested in knowing why historically the humanitarian sector and the framework for welcoming and assisting refugees has never taken economics into account, and why we have a system right now which seems to be based solely on the moral grounds of assisting and welcoming refugees, and why the economic dimension of either the impact of hosting refugees or how to assist them better, and also like the positive contribution of refugees economically has never been taken into account.
I don't know who wants to answer first.
I think the two questions actually linked very well together, and maybe it's because of law school or something like this, but I'm a very pragmatic person, I feel, right? I think I am. I try to be. So when we get a lot of these policies that are put forward from a humanitarian point of view or what have you, they tend to lack in many elements a very pragmatic understanding of the consequences when, for example, refugees or asylum seekers or economic migrants who arrive in your country. So let's take the circumstance of Sweden, right? And in other European countries where there's been this uptick in crime, right? And from a humanitarian point of view, of course, we want to help people, and we should help people who are in circumstances where they're left stateless, right? Where going back is literally life or death. But at the same time, governments need to then be as vigilant in creating environments that are viable for people to actually earn a living, a legal living in the countries in which they're accepted. And it seems to me as though governments have been ill-prepared, especially with the sheer number, which also could be a factor of people who are being forced to migrate. As I mentioned, the UNHCR said as at the end of 2015, some 65 million people were forcibly displaced. That's about one in every 113 people, if I believe. And I think that's such an incredible number for you to be able to try and adopt if you're going to have 200,000 people coming into your economy and you haven't matched any skill set to people being able to go into a certain job so they can earn a living, and you haven't taken into consideration education of people of your culture and education of people within your culture of the incoming cultures that are coming in as well. And I think pragmatically, there needs to be more of an emphasis on that part as well. And also the danger is not to then make that the entire analysis of whether to allow in people into your country, whether they're going to be economically beneficial to your society, but it certainly needs to be a bigger part of the vetting process, if you will, when you do allow people in. So I think those were really good questions, and unfortunately, not much attention has been given to them.
My comment on that is actually that Canada, a report was just released actually that kind of, it's called the Development Institute, that talked about Canada's immigration policies, and it's actually got somewhat of a different trend than other countries because some have protected borders. In Canada, mostly privileged economic migration as opposed to humanitarian migration. But it's seen from the perspective of, what is the economic benefit to the nation versus, the other lens being economic migration economics is driving, the flux of migrants. The Canadian perspective is, well, what do we need? What are the labor shortages we need to fill? And over time, the immigration processes have changed. And so when my parents came, it was much more, it was also easier for them to get in because Canada was looking for laborers, and so they were let in fairly easily. Over time, the immigration system changed to the point system. So in fact, we're talking about the vetting process. That actually is the Canadian system. Point, depending on your education status, your level of education, you get different checks crossed off. So I think that, I don't know, to properly answer that question, have to have a really solid analysis of how this plays out globally. But I think that depending on the country, it actually is taken into consideration. So I don't know if the question is so much is economic migration being looked at, but it's more that the flows today are the numbers are just so great that countries don't know how to manage them. And so there's a gap, again, the gap in policy, which maybe is back to the question about do we need another kind of permit to fill that gap. That's helpful. Thoughts?
Professor Reagan, did you want to say something?
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate the questioner about rape for his bravery. It's a rather, it gives me some occasion for amusement as well, but an otherwise dismal morning, so thanks for enlivening the day. But seriously, I would like to take your question as a very important and real one. Julian Assange is being questioned by Swedish prosecutors, I believe, in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, which they have finally agreed to do after a long period of not agreeing to do that. And as you know, he's been accused of rape in Sweden, since we're talking about rape in Sweden. That's the starting point of the question. Now, it turns out that the definition of rape in Sweden is extremely broad. So many things that would be considered sexual crime, perhaps of some kind, but not rape in many other countries, including Canada, are defined as rape in Sweden. So since Julian Assange has brought that fact to our general attention, or Julian Assange's case, I think we can safely assume that the rate of rape in Sweden, as officially designated, is lower than, is higher than in some sense we would think is really appropriate if we were to use an internationally comparable standard. Or perhaps you think that Sweden's standard should be applied everywhere else, in which case that will also change how we evaluate the comparison. Now, as to the question as to whether the migrants specifically are responsible for this, certainly it's true that there are very deep-seated differences in cultural attitudes with respect to gender in particular, and in fact, The Guardian had a very fascinating video, which I commend to all of you, about a class which is being held in a small town in northern Norway to try to educate young Arab refugee claimants in Norway in the attitudes toward women that are appropriate in Norway. And the video brings out very sensitively, it was just put up about a month ago, you'll easily find it if you look for it, the culture clash that's involved, in that in some sense there is a difference, but there's also a degree of alarmism in Norway about the attitudes of migrants, in particular Arab migrants and refugee claimants, which may be not justified. Zula pointed to the excellent point that some of the nexus with criminality, which is real, is associated with the lack of access to other kinds of opportunities. At least historically, that's how it originated. Now, that having been, shouldn't provide too much of an excuse for it. And I think that once it becomes a problem within the society is concerned, it has to be addressed through patient police work and also through attacking the causes of crime. Is the slogan of New Labour put it, they're tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. Well, that's a pretty good slogan if you're a government, I think. But make sure to be tough on the causes. That the cultural cannot be the starting point and the ending point of the analysis, much as it may play a role, to use Naomi Klein's term and others' term. There's there. So yes, that should be recognized. We shouldn't shy away from that, and I think that the conservatives who point to that are right. But the idea that there's civilizations here isn't right. I mean, the Swedes were famously liberal in their attitudes towards sexuality, and also famously gender equitable much before other Western Europeans. You don't have to bring in the Arabs, for goodness sake. I mean, it was a difference between the Italians and the Swedes, as before it was a difference that we noticed between Swedes and Syrians. So we have to have a sophisticated enough social scientific account of all of these phenomena, and then we can get somewhere. So you ask a good question, it's a legitimate question, it's an important question, but we cannot start and end with the idea, much as there's an element of truth in it, that certain societies have cultural attitudes which are very different. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the answer. If I just may very, very quickly build up on that, and then we will just conclude. I just want to say that, once again, just from a very practical point of view, we have a tendency to culturalize issues facing migrants, and this is something we see at a very low level, for example, at school, where we have kids from certain countries, and then the approach of the school will be like, well, in a sense, they come from that country, so there's a higher tendency for them to drop out of school because people from such and such countries are less educated or such remarks. And just, as a settlement worker, having to mediate the intervention of the school and that of the migrants, one thing that we have to do is deculturalize problems affecting migrants and humanize them in a sense, because we would not approach, for example, school dropout of a kid that was born in Canada the same way that we approach it from a kid that's not born in Canada, while in reality the issue is the same. So we have to address why teenagers drop out of school. Is it because there's problems at home? Is it because of their immigration status? Or is it because they are Roma and Roma are quote unquote uneducated? So I think by framing, the rhetoric around migrant issues in such a way, we also influence policies about inclusion of migrants and policies of acceptance also of
There's a
migrants.
problem of integration, that's the problem. The real issue is the integration of the migrants into
But
society.
integration in a sense, like for example, just to give you, because just one perspective. So we had, for example, a lot of Roma coming to Canada as refugees over the last year. And in fact, when I was hired at the school as a non-for-profit organization working with Roma, I was called upon to deal with a crisis of, Roma refugees. So that this was the situation that was presented to me, is like, we need help, there's a Roma crisis, there's all these Roma coming to Canada, we don't know what to do with them. This is essentially what I was told. And then, so when I got to the school and the quote unquote crisis, they were like, well, these people cannot integrate, we cannot communicate with them, they are not attending schools, and they just, for example, randomly don't show up and one day they disappear. But in reality is that Roma were in precarious status because the Canadian government has introduced a wave of policies directly discriminating Roma refugees, where the acceptance rate decreased of 90% since 1998 to 2012. Roma who were claiming asylum seekers were almost 98% sure to be refused. So we had families coming here claiming asylum status, and because the process was very long until that they received their hearing and that the claim is refused, there's been for 3 years passing. In these 3 years passing, the kids know that they eventually will be deported because the likeliness that they're going to be accepted is very low. So the motivation for school is very limited because in the countries where they escaped, there is segregation of Roma children, meaning that not only they were before segregated, but if they go back to those countries, they will be placed in the levels that they left. So we had 15-year-old kids going back to country, having to start from primary school, for example. So the motivation level is very low for integration, and this is a reflect also of policies inflicted by government. That's one point. Secondly, in terms of communication, these parents didn't speak English or French, and the communication that was sent to them was all written in French. So of course, they didn't show up to parents' meeting because they didn't understand the letter. So that's one thing. And then the response of the school was like, well, let's put all the Roma kids in one class. I mean, that's the definition of segregation. So, and this is not an ill-intentioned policy or approach, it's simply a lack of awareness. So we came and we were like, we're not gonna do a Roma project, we're gonna do a project for all asylum seekers and migrant youth because the issues they face are relatively the same. So like, it has nothing to do with culture, it has to do with precarious status, for example. And then we see that kids, for example, in Southeast Asia, who are also facing similar conditions in lower education levels, for example, or we had kids from Pakistan and from India, from Cuba, from everywhere who are facing the very same issues, for example, Roma asylum seekers are facing at school. And then when we address them as a societal issue rather than a cultural issue, we realize that the things that are put in place are more prone to create, quote unquote, better integration. And this is at school, for example, but like when we presented a case, we're like, oh, well, this is a Roma case, you can intervene. And then when the youth was not Roma, they're like, oh, well, he's not Roma, so you can't do anything. And so essentially, well, what we did is we decided to intervene anyways, and we realized that it was not a question of culture. It was a question of, it was a human issue in a sense. It's not, there's not one culture in the world that promotes, lack of education and rape, I don't think. I think those are historical instances that are imposed. And if you look at the Arab world, for example, there are gender issues, they're not cultural issues. I mean, we see this across countries around the world, and it is not to say that there's a culture that promotes rape, I don't think. There's historical instances where those things exist in certain countries, but they're a reflection, I think, of policies and governments and not of religions anyway. So that was just my comments. And so we're just gonna conclude there. Once again, I wanted to thank all of our speakers today. So we had Elvira Trial from the Canadian Council of Refugees. You can also go and check out their website. There's a lot of information about policies, not only on human trafficking, but generally on immigration and refugee policies on their website. It's very, very well done. So you can go check out the Canadian Council of Refugees, and they're doing many campaigns if you want to support them as well. So I'm losing my voice. We had also Sanjay Reddy with us from the New School of Economics at Columbia University. So we're very thankful also to have him with us virtually. And last but not least, Mr. I can't pronounce your last name, so I'm just going to go slow and Sura from Devon Hands Africa, which are also Mr. made on social media and also have a website which we have on the Facebook page where we promoted the event. There's a link to the website if you also wish to look at their activities. And finally, Romanita, you can also find us on social media to find out more about our activities. And we have a second panel at 1. I raised them, so for those of you interested. So thank you again once for everybody who came and for all the panelists. Thank you. Just,